Welcome, chosen ones. There's a difference between someone who stays quiet because they're weak and someone who stays quiet because they've already measured everything in the room. That kind of silence isn't empty. It's calculated, intentional, and grounded. While others rush to react, to prove, to dominate, this person observes, processes, and waits. And that patience becomes power. Because when they finally move, it's not out of impulse, it's out of certainty. People often realize too late that what they thought was harmless restraint was actually disciplined control, and by the time that realization hits, the outcome has already been decided. This is where people miscalculate the most. When they cross someone who moves with quiet alignment and doesn't feel the need to prove anything, they assume nothing will come of it. No reaction, no retaliation, no visible response. But that silence isn't absence, it's timing. Because individuals like this don't rush to correct others, they allow things to unfold exactly as they should. And over time, situations shift, outcomes reverse, and consequences surface in ways no one can trace back to a single moment. What looked like an easy move turns into a chain reaction they never saw coming, unfolding long after they thought it was over. And when everything begins to unfold, the truth has a way of circling back to its origin. People may try to hide their intentions, justify their actions, or rewrite the narrative, but deep down, everyone remembers where it started. What often goes unnoticed is that betrayal rarely comes from confidence. It comes from discomfort. It's triggered by something unspoken, something unsettled within. When someone carries a presence that is grounded, aware, and unshaken, it naturally reveals what others try to conceal. Not through force, not through confrontation, but simply by existing in a way that leaves no room for illusion. And for those who aren't ready to face themselves, that kind of exposure feels threatening, even when no threat was ever made. So instead of confronting what's broken within them, they turn their focus outward, trying to silence or remove whatever reflects it back. But that strategy is flawed from the start. You can't erase something that's rooted in truth, and you certainly can't dismantle integrity by attacking it. What ends up happening is a quiet reversal. The same qualities they dismissed, consistency, restraint, self-control, become the very factors that expose their missteps. And over time, it's not the steady presence that fades. It's the ones who tried to undermine it who unravel, realizing too late that they were fighting something they never had the power to defeat. What they dismissed as passivity quietly evolved into precision. The patience they mocked turned into perfectly timed decisions. The empathy they took advantage of sharpened into clear boundaries, and the silence they ignored became undeniable evidence over time. Nothing was wasted. Every moment they thought they were getting away with something was actually being observed, processed, and stored. And when everything finally surfaced, it didn't need exaggeration or defense. It spoke for itself. Meanwhile, they're left confused, repeating the same mistakes, unable to see that the consequences they face were set in motion by their own actions from the very beginning. This isn't about settling scores or getting even. It's about a cycle that plays out over and over in different environments, with different faces, but the same outcome. Whenever someone misreads quiet strength as weakness and decides to take advantage of it, they unknowingly set their own decline in motion. At first, nothing seems to happen, which only reinforces their assumption. But gradually, things begin to shift. Trust erodes, credibility slips, and the story they once controlled starts to unravel in front of others. And by the time they recognize what's happening, it's no longer something they can fix or hide. What they lost wasn't just a person. It was stability, respect, and the version of reality they thought they could maintain indefinitely. If you've ever questioned how someone can be so confident while unknowingly setting their own downfall in motion, this is where it becomes clear. It's not about reacting louder or proving a point. It's about understanding what unfolds when things are left to align on their own. There's a quiet precision in allowing truth to surface at the right moment, without interference or force. While arrogance pushes for control and immediate validation, something deeper operates with patience and accuracy. And in that space, outcomes don't need to be forced. They reveal themselves, often exposing everything the other person tried to hide without a single word needing to be said. Before we step into the first point, take a moment to truly lock in your presence here. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a like to align yourself with this message. If something here resonates with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs this clarity right now. You didn't come across this by accident. There's a reason you're hearing this at this exact moment. So step into it and own it. Drop 444 in the comments so I can recognize everyone who's truly tapped in. Now, let's move into the first point. Number 1, they read your composure as a lack of strength, when in reality it revealed the limits of their own understanding. When you didn't respond with chaos, didn't rush to defend yourself, and didn't match their energy, it disrupted the script they were relying on. They expected noise, emotion, and immediate reaction, because that's the only language they recognize. So in the absence of that, they filled in the silence with assumptions. But what they failed to see is that your restraint wasn't hesitation, it was control. And in choosing not to react, you didn't lose power. You exposed exactly where theirs came from. That false confidence pushed them to escalate, thinking there would be no real outcome to what they were doing. They spoke more freely, acted more carelessly, and crossed boundaries they would have respected if they had understood the full picture. But what they misread as hesitations was actually discipline. You weren't holding back out of fear. You were choosing when and how to respond. That level of awareness isn't passive, it's intentional. And while they kept revealing more of themselves with every step, you remained grounded, seeing everything clearly, knowing that not every action requires an immediate reaction to carry real consequence. You weren't caught in the chaos. They were. While emotions drove their actions, you stayed grounded, observing everything with clarity. Every shift in tone, every contradiction, every moment of hesitation didn't go unnoticed. You saw who aligned themselves with the narrative and who subtly distanced themselves from it. You noticed the timing, the inconsistencies, the pressure points. And the most important part, they had no idea. Because while they thought you were disengaged or unaware, you were actually present in a different way, absorbing details, connecting patterns, and allowing the full picture to reveal itself without ever needing to announce that you were paying attention. This is where everything started to turn against them. When someone is driven by insecurity, silence and composure feel threatening, almost like a spotlight they can't escape. Your calm didn't provoke them, it exposed them. And because they couldn't sit with that discomfort, they kept pushing, testing, trying to force a reaction that would make their actions feel justified. But instead of getting what they wanted, they revealed more. Every attempt to provoke only added another layer of clarity, another piece of proof. Without realizing it, they weren't gaining control. They were building the very case that would eventually undo them. Every message, every inconsistency, every careless word they let slip became part of a pattern they didn't realize was forming. They moved as if nothing was being noticed, assuming your silence meant a lack of awareness. But in reality, you were seeing everything with precision. What they thought was hesitation was actually evaluation. You weren't unsure, you were measuring. Deciding what stayed, what ended, and who no longer had the same level of access to you. And by the time they sensed the shift, it wasn't a reaction. It was a conclusion you had already reached long before they saw it coming. With every moment you chose restraint, they grew more comfortable, revealing who they really were. That false sense of control pushed them to act without filters, letting hidden traits surface naturally. Subtle jealousy, quiet hostility, the urge to overpower someone they assumed wouldn't respond. But the more they leaned into that behavior, the less they could hide it. And when everything finally came to light, it didn't require confrontation or explanation. The truth stood on its own, clear and undeniable, because it was built from their own actions, not your reaction. It was grounded in proof, built through consistency, and strengthened over time. That's why, when everything shifted, it hit them harder than they were prepared for. They assumed your silence meant you lacked a defense, when in reality, you had already secured your position without needing to say a word. You weren't reacting because you were uncertain. You were quiet because you were certain. And that's where they miscalculated. They didn't fall because you came after them. They fell because they misjudged someone who was already anchored, someone who didn't need validation, didn't need to argue, and didn't need to prove anything to stand firmly in their truth. Number 2, they mistook your compassion for blind acceptance and walked straight into a boundary they didn't know existed. They saw your willingness to understand, your patience, your ability to hear people out, and assumed that meant you wouldn't question anything. So they got comfortable bending the truth, shifting narratives, and relying on your kindness as a shield. But what they didn't realize is that empathy, when paired with awareness, sharpens over time. It doesn't stay naive, it evolves. And the more they revealed, the clearer their patterns became. What they thought was access turned into exposure. Because your understanding didn't make you easier to manipulate, it made you harder to deceive. That's where they misunderstood you completely. Your empathy wasn't a weakness. It was a heightened awareness. You weren't just hearing what was said, you were sensing what was off. The pauses, the shifts in energy, the inconsistencies beneath the surface, they didn't go unnoticed. Even when you didn't immediately label it, something within you registered the imbalance. Your intuition was gathering signals before your thoughts could fully form them. And while they believed they were getting away with subtle manipulation, you were already feeling the disconnect, quietly piecing together a truth they assumed you'd never catch. You started to notice the small things that didn't quite align, the hesitation before a response, the over-explaining that felt rehearsed, the apologies that sounded right but led to no real change. It wasn't about doubting them. It was about recognizing patterns. Your awareness sharpened with every interaction, and what once felt like openness began to shift. The same empathy that allowed you to understand people now began to sort truth from performance. It stopped being something they could move through freely and became something they had to pass through, and not everything made it across. You began to draw clear lines where there used to be overlap. You could sense the difference between genuine struggle and calculated behavior, between someone opening up and someone putting on a show. That clarity rewired how you responded. You didn't shut down. You refined your perception, and the more they leaned into emotional tactics, the more transparent those tactics became. What once might have moved you now stood out as intentional, almost predictable. In trying to pull you in, they only revealed how controlled their actions really were, making it impossible for you to engage the same way again. They believed that repeating the same emotional appeals would keep working, but instead, it clarified everything. You stopped reacting to isolated moments and began seeing the structure behind them. It wasn't just what they said, it was what always came after. The same apologies leading to the same outcomes, the same charm used to reset the situation, the same avoidance when accountability was needed. What once felt situational became predictable, and once you saw the pattern, it lost its power, because you weren't responding to the story anymore. You were responding to the truth behind it. Your empathy kept you grounded long enough to witness the entire cycle, not just the parts meant to pull on your emotions. You saw how it started, how it unfolded, and how it repeated. And instead of reacting, something within you shifted. You didn't become distant or harsh, you became precise. You no longer internalized what didn't belong to you. No accusations, no drama, just quiet clarity. And that's what unsettled them most. Because they couldn't provoke you into playing a role anymore. You simply stepped out of it, leaving them to face the weight of their own patterns without your participation. And the moment you stopped taking on what was never yours, the entire dynamic collapsed. Manipulation depends on blurred boundaries, on you second-guessing your instincts and giving more than you should. But once you saw things clearly, There was nothing left for them to work with. You didn't need to raise your voice or change who you were. You just stopped participating in what wasn't real. And that's what shifted everything. They didn't lose their place because you pushed them away. They lost it because you stopped ignoring the truth within yourself. You didn't lose your compassion. You refined it. You still showed up with understanding, but now it had structure, limits, and self-respect built into it. It wasn't open access anymore. It was intentional. You could still feel deeply, still recognize what others were going through, but you no longer allowed that awareness to override your own well-being, and that's what made it untouchable. Because empathy with boundaries doesn't shut down. It becomes precise. It knows where to give, where to pause, and where to step back without guilt. Number 3, they completely misread the depth behind your calm presence. What they labeled as softness was actually restraint guided by awareness. Because you didn't feel the need to overpower, interrupt, or escalate, they assumed there was nothing strategic behind your behavior. They overlooked the fact that quiet doesn't mean unaware, and calm doesn't mean incapable. While they relied on noise and control to navigate situations, you moved with intention, choosing when to speak and when to stay still. And in that space, they exposed themselves because they never realized they were dealing with someone who understood far more than they showed. They assumed they could test your limits, cross boundaries, and face no real outcome because you didn't respond the way they expected. But that belief was built on a complete misunderstanding. What they saw as softness wasn't a lack of strength. It was a conscious choice. You weren't unaware of what was happening. You were choosing how to engage with it. There's a level of intelligence in knowing when not to react, when not to give energy, and when to let things reveal themselves. And that kind of control isn't accidental. It's intentional, measured, and far more powerful than they realized. It gave you the ability to stay present without getting pulled into the noise, to read between the lines without needing to challenge everything out loud, and to choose your response with clarity instead of reaction. While they were moving off impulse, trying to trigger something out of you, you remained steady, taking in the full picture. Every detail mattered. The tone, the timing, the contradictions. And while they thought they were in control of the situation, you were quietly understanding it in a way they couldn't, seeing patterns form in real time without ever needing to announce that you already knew. You weren't missing anything. You were noticing everything. Your awareness wasn't reactive, it was intentional, quietly tracking details as they unfolded. While they assumed you weren't paying attention, they relaxed their guard, speaking more openly, revealing more than they intended. The more comfortable they became, the more they exposed. Intention slipped out, inconsistencies stacked up, and patterns began to form clearly. What they thought was a safe space to operate was actually the exact environment where their truth became impossible to hide, all because they underestimated the level of awareness they were dealing with. Every word they threw out, every exaggeration, every attempt to assert control became a clue pointing back to them. What they believed made them look powerful actually revealed where they were insecure, where they overcompensated, and where their limits truly were. They thought they were setting the tone, but they were outlining their own weaknesses in real time. And as they kept trying to assert dominance, they unknowingly mapped out exactly who they were, making it easier for you to understand them without ever needing to challenge them directly. In their effort to manage you, they unknowingly revealed everything you needed to see. What they thought was control became transparency. And while they misread your calm as a lack of strength, it was actually a different kind of power, one that doesn't need to announce itself to exist. It watches, it understands, and it moves with intention rather than impulse. You didn't need to prove anything or push back aggressively. You simply allowed things to unfold, knowing that real power isn't loud. It's precise, patient, and fully aware of when to act and when to step aside. And when it finally clicked that you weren't going to respond the way they planned for, their composure started to crack. What once felt controlled turned rushed, inconsistent, and exposed. They began over-explaining, contradicting themselves, trying to regain control of a narrative that was already slipping. The more they tried to fix it, the more obvious everything became. Because they never accounted for someone who stays grounded, who doesn't react on impulse, and who understands that real strength isn't in forcing outcomes. It's in allowing truth to surface without interference. They confused your composure with fragility, and that misunderstanding became their downfall. In trying to take advantage of what they thought was a weakness, they revealed far more about themselves than they ever intended. What they failed to recognize is that your calm was never emptiness. It was awareness held in control. A quiet intelligence that doesn't compete for attention, doesn't rush to prove itself, but sees everything clearly. And by the time they started to realize that, the outcome was already set. They weren't outplayed by force. They were outmatched by something they never fully understood. Number 4. In trying to push you past your limits, they set off a shift they had no control over. What they intended as pressure became a turning point. They expected confusion, hesitation, maybe even collapse, but instead, something within you realigned. The more they tried to destabilize you, the more grounded you became. What was meant to weaken you clarified you. And once that clarity locked in, there was no reversing it, because what they activated wasn't doubt. It was awareness on a level that doesn't go back once it's seen the truth. What they failed to realize is that pressure reveals structure in someone who is grounded. It doesn't break it. Instead of falling apart, you adjusted, refined, and recalibrated in ways they couldn't anticipate. The moment they went too far, something within you locked into place. It wasn't just resilience. It was clarity at a deeper level. You began seeing situations, people, and patterns without distortion. And once that level of understanding is reached, it doesn't fade. It becomes a permanent shift, one that changes how you move, what you accept, and what you'll never allow again. Before that shift, you made room for things that didn't deserve it. You overclarified, overextended, and offered understanding in places where responsibility should have been required. But their actions created a breaking point, not fueled by resentment, but by awareness. It wasn't about becoming harsh. It was about becoming accurate. You started recognizing what was yours to carry and what was never meant to be yours at all. And in that realization, your approach changed. Not out of reaction, but out of a necessary realignment with your own standards. And that's when everything started to realign from within. Your standards became clearer, your limits more defined, and your energy more intentional. You no longer poured into spaces that couldn't hold it, or people who didn't respect it. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was subtle, steady, and undeniable. From the outside, nothing seemed dramatic, but internally, everything had shifted. You were no longer operating the same way, and that quiet transformation changed every interaction moving forward. It happened almost without you noticing. The reactions that once felt automatic simply weren't there anymore. Situations that used to pull you in now passed by without impact, and people who once affected your mood no longer held that influence. Conversations that once felt urgent started to feel optional, even unnecessary. And it wasn't because you shut down. It was because you adjusted. You became centered in a way that didn't depend on external validation or response. That quiet shift wasn't detachment. It was clarity settling into place. When someone pushes you beyond a certain point, the shift that follows isn't loud or dramatic. It's precise. Things start to reposition quietly. Your perspective changes, your awareness sharpens, and what once felt unclear becomes obvious. There's no going back to how you saw things before. Because once you recognize a pattern, it stays recognized. You don't need time to figure it out anymore. You see it as it happens. And that level of awareness changes everything. Because what used to take experience to understand now becomes something you detect instantly without hesitation. You begin to pick up on shifts before they fully form. Something in the energy, the tone, the timing feels off even before anything is said. Your approach changes without force. You don't feel the need to respond to everything, to explain, or to engage the same way. Instead, you step back, take in more, and act with intention. And in that space, the things that once worked on you lose their effect. The same behaviors, the same tactics, the same attempts to provoke no longer land. What used to pull a reaction now meets stillness, because you're no longer operating from the same place you once did. What once had the power to affect you now feels distant, almost uninteresting. The same behaviors that used to pull you in no longer hold your attention. And while you've moved into a different level of awareness, they're left facing the shift they helped trigger but can't reverse. They may try to explain themselves, reshape the narrative, or reach for understanding, but it no longer lands the same. Not because you've become closed off, but because you've outgrown the space where those dynamics once had influence. The shift has already settled into place, and there's nothing left to argue or prove. It's not anger driving your distance, it's clarity. You're simply no longer accessible in the way you once were. And that's what they feel the most. They aim to control the dynamic, to pull you into something that would keep you reacting. But instead, they pushed you into a space where you no longer needed to engage at all. What they intended as pressure became the moment you stepped fully into yourself, operating from a place they can't reach anymore. Instead of breaking you, they refined your understanding of yourself. And what unsettles them most is realizing there's no way to rewind to that shift. The moment things crossed a certain line, something in you settled permanently. You don't return to old versions of yourself once clarity sets in. You move forward with a stronger sense of direction, a deeper trust in your instincts, and a standard that doesn't bend for anything that disrupts your balance. Number 5. What they intended as isolation quietly reversed direction. They tried to limit your support, distort your perspective, and make you second-guess your own instincts, believing distance would weaken you. But instead of disconnecting from yourself, you became more anchored. You learned to rely on your own clarity, your own awareness, your own sense of truth. And while they were focused on separating you from others, they slowly distanced themselves from credibility, from trust, from genuine connection. In trying to isolate you, they ended up creating the very separation they feared. Only it was them who stood alone in the end. They believed that by shaping the story, influencing perceptions, and quietly creating doubt, they could box you into a position you couldn't escape. It was calculated, intentional, and built on the idea that control would give them the upper hand. But what they overlooked is that truth doesn't rely on manipulation to survive. The more they tried to restrict, distort, and contain, the more obvious everything became. Because when someone is grounded in clarity, pressure doesn't trap them. It reveals who's applying it. And in the process, the very strategy meant to limit you ends up exposing them instead. You didn't get pulled into the chaos they were creating. While they moved behind the scenes trying to shift perceptions and control outcomes, you remained steady in how you carried yourself. There was no urgency to react, no need to counter every move. You allowed things to unfold without interference, grounded in what you knew was real. And as they continued to act, layer by layer, everything became more visible. Without confrontation, without noise, the truth started to separate itself from the narrative they were trying to build. You stayed aligned with who you are, without shifting to match the pressure around you. That consistency didn't go unnoticed. People observed the contrast, the steadiness in you versus the inconsistency elsewhere. Without needing to explain yourself, your actions spoke clearly over time. And while their circle began to thin out, shaped by doubt and contradiction, yours remained grounded. Built on trust and authenticity, it didn't need constant reinforcement. It held because it was real. In trying to separate you from others, they ended up revealing more about themselves than they ever intended. The effort to control, to influence, to quietly shape perceptions didn't stay hidden. It became visible through their actions. What was meant to distance you only highlighted their patterns, their insecurity, and their need to manage everything around them. And over time, people began to see it for what it was. The distance they tried to create around you slowly formed around them instead, leaving them isolated by their own behavior. People who once stayed neutral started to notice the shift. The patterns became harder to ignore. The inconsistencies, the pressure, the tone behind their actions. What may have once been excused or overlooked began to stand out clearly. And as that clarity spread, perspectives changed. Those who once remained open-minded began to step back, not out of influence, but out of their own observations. Over time, the space around them grew quieter, not because of anything said against them, but because their behavior spoke louder than any explanation could. What stands out is that isolation isn't only about who's physically around you, it's about what your energy attracts or repels. In trying to confine you, they projected tension, control, and negativity that people could feel, even if it wasn't openly spoken. And that energy naturally pushed support away from them. At the same time, your steadiness created the opposite effect. Without forcing anything, your presence drew in alignment, trust, and the right connections. What they tried to restrict only redirected energy away from them and toward you, where it could actually resonate. Their actions built a space around them that felt tense and uninviting, something others instinctively chose to step away from. What they projected, fear, pressure, control, didn't pull people in, it pushed them out. And in trying to manage who had access to you, they revealed more about themselves than they intended. The effort to control the situation turned into a reflection of their own imbalance. In the end, it wasn't you who became isolated. It was them, standing in the environment they created, surrounded by the consequences of their own approach. The more they tried to control everything, the more everything slipped out of their reach. What they tightened, the world quietly released. And in that contrast, the outcome became undeniable. What was meant to confine you only revealed how little they actually held on to. The space they tried to restrict you in became the space they ended up standing in alone. And the deeper irony is this: the effort to limit someone grounded and aligned didn't weaken that person at all. It only exposed the emptiness behind the attempt, leaving them facing the reality they created without anything left to hide behind. Number 6, the way they came at you revealed more than they intended. What they framed as control carried a sense of urgency that didn't match true confidence. The intensity, the constant need to push, the force behind their actions, it all pointed to something unsettled beneath the surface. Real strength doesn't rush or overextend itself, but their approach did. And in that overreach, it became clear that what they were trying to project as dominance was actually a reaction to something they couldn't manage internally. Those who truly have control don't chase validation or exhaust themselves trying to prove a point. Their actions are measured, their presence steady, and their confidence doesn't need an audience. There's no urgency to dominate every situation or win every moment. But when fear is driving someone, it shows in the excess, the over-explaining, the constant escalation, the need to be seen as right at all costs. It creates noise where there should be clarity. And over time, that difference becomes impossible to ignore. Because real stability speaks through consistency, while fear reveals itself through pressure and urgency. And in directing all that intensity toward you, they ended up revealing what they were trying to hide: the push to overwhelm, the attempts to shake your confidence, the pressure to make you second-guess yourself. It wasn't strategy, it was exposure. They assumed force would blur the truth, that if they came strong enough, it would cover what was underneath. But aggression doesn't conceal insecurity, it amplifies it. And the more they tried to overpower the situation, the clearer it became that they weren't operating from certainty. They were reacting to something they couldn't control within themselves. But the harder they pushed for control, the clearer their instability became. Every sharp word, every calculated move, every attempt to trap you revealed more than it concealed. What they believed was strategy started to look like reaction. The pressure they applied didn't strengthen their position. It exposed the urgency behind it. And over time, it became obvious that they weren't acting from a place of control at all, but from something far more unsettled that they could no longer keep hidden. But what they didn't realize is that fear doesn't sharpen judgment. It distorts it, and their actions reflected that clearly. Every move they made carried the weight of that imbalance, leading them further away from control rather than closer to it. They assumed pressure would break you, that reaction would follow, that chaos would meet chaos. But you didn't move that way. You stayed grounded, deliberate, and aware. And in that contrast, their insecurity didn't just remain hidden. It became amplified, standing out even more against your steadiness. You stayed grounded in who you are, without needing to shift or defend your position. While they kept pressing forward, trying to force outcomes, they only revealed more with each move. The inconsistencies grew clearer, the exaggerations more noticeable, the need to justify more obvious. What they thought was working in their favor was actually stacking against them. Over time, it became undeniable. Everything they did carried the same underlying pattern, and that pattern spoke louder than anything you ever needed to say. And the contradiction couldn't be ignored. In trying so hard to assert control over you, they slowly lost control of how they were perceived. The effort to dominate revealed cracks they couldn't hide, subtle shifts in behavior, the urgency in their tone, the avoidance when responsibility surfaced. Others began to pick up on it without needing it explained. What was meant to establish authority started to erode their credibility, because the more they pushed, the more transparent their imbalance became. What they tried to keep contained couldn't stay hidden. It showed up in everything they did. The pressure, the tone, the constant need to push all carried the same underlying signal. And instead of strengthening their position, it worked against them. The more they acted from that place, the more their actions turned inward, creating consequences they couldn't control. By the time everything settled, it was clear that nothing you did caused their downfall. It was the energy behind their own actions, repeated over time, that led them exactly where they ended up. They confused composure with lack of awareness, and kindness with something they could take advantage of. But each move they made from that misunderstanding only made things clearer. The more they pushed, the more their intentions surfaced without effort. What they thought was strategy became exposure. And over time, everything they tried to build, every version of the story, every attempt to control perception, began to fall apart on its own, unable to hold against the reality they had already revealed. Congratulations. You made it all the way to the end of this message. That alone says something about you. I genuinely appreciate you being here. Your presence adds strength to this space in ways you might not even realize yet. If this message resonated with you, don't just let it pass. Lock it in by subscribing to the channel. Turn the notification bell so you never miss a video. And finally, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs this clarity. And drop 1111 in the comments to affirm your alignment and mark this moment in your journey. Make sure your notification bell is on so you stay connected to every message meant for you. I appreciate you more than you know. Stay aligned, stay protected, and keep moving forward.